She swore she'd die alone before marrying a stranger. But when that train pulled into the station and she saw him, a man she'd only known through ink and paper, everything she believed shattered in an instant. It wasn't his broad shoulders or work-worn hands that broke her. It was the single tear that traced down his weathered cheek, a tear that held more truth than 1,000 spoken promises. That tear changed everything. Stay with me until the end of this story and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The wind had no mercy on the high plains of Montana Territory, 1887. It screamed across the flatlands like a thing possessed, bending the wild grass into submission and rattling the loose boards of the old Whitmore farmhouse until Margaret thought the whole structure might simply give up and blow away. Sometimes, on nights like this, she almost wished it would. She stood at the kitchen window, her reflection ghostly in the glass, backlit by the single oil lamp on the table behind her. At 28, Margaret Whitmore was considered an old maid by the standards of Creek Bend, the small town 7 miles east where she went once a month for supplies. The women there whispered about her, poor Margaret, all alone on that failing farm, too proud to accept help, too stubborn to marry. They didn't understand. They couldn't. They hadn't held their mother's hand as fever took her, hadn't dug their father's grave with their own blistered hands when his heart simply stopped one morning in the barn. They hadn't learned that people left, that promises crumbled, that love was just another crop that could fail. Margaret turned from the window and surveyed her domain. The kitchen was clean but sparse. A table, 2 chairs, she'd burned the other 2 for firewood last winter, a cast-iron stove that worked when it felt like it, and shelves that held more empty space than provisions. The whole house echoed with absence. Her parents' bedroom remained closed. She couldn't bear to sleep there or clear it out. Her own small room at the back of the house held a narrow bed and a trunk containing her mother's wedding dress, wrapped in muslin she never looked at. The farm itself was 70 acres of stubbornness. The soil was decent when rain came, but rain was a fickle visitor. She'd managed to keep 20 acres in wheat, maintained a small vegetable garden, and cared for 6 chickens, 2 goats, and 1 ancient horse named Steadfast, who was as worn out as she felt. It was enough to survive, barely, but not enough to truly live. She'd had offers, of course. Martin Fletcher, the banker's son, had proposed twice with all the passion of a man negotiating a property transfer, which Margaret supposed was exactly what it would have been. His second offer came with an itemized list of improvements he'd make to the farm once it was properly managed. She'd burned the list in her stove and hadn't spoken to him since. Then there was William Cross, a widower 20 years her senior with 6 children and breath that could wilt flowers. He'd cornered her outside the general store and explained quite matter-of-factly that he needed a wife to raise his children and she needed a man to run her farm, so they might as well be practical about it. She told him she'd rather be practical about remaining alone. The truth was, Margaret had loved once, when she was 19 and still believed in the softness of the world. Thomas Brennan had courted her properly, with flowers picked from the wild meadow and promises whispered under the cottonwood tree by the creek. They were engaged to be married in the spring. Then gold was discovered in the Black Hills, and Thomas got that fever in his eyes that gold brings to foolish men. He left in March, promising to return wealthy enough to give her everything she deserved. She never saw him again. Word came back that he'd been killed in a mining accident, buried in a hillside cave-in, along with 17 other men who'd chased the same glittering dream. Margaret had mourned, but the mourning had crystallized into something harder. She'd learned that men were driven by things beyond reason, beyond love, by ambition, by pride, by the restless need for something always just beyond the horizon. She'd learned that depending on anyone but herself was a fool's game, so she'd built her walls, tended her diminishing farm, and convinced herself that solitude was preferable to the inevitable disappointment of companionship. That was before Sarah Chen changed everything. Sarah was Chinese-American, married to a Scottish railroad worker named Duncan, and together they'd opened a small restaurant in Creek Bend that served the most peculiar and wonderful combination of Scottish meat pies and Chinese dumplings. Sarah was the closest thing Margaret had to a friend, mainly because Sarah was too practical to engage in the town's gossip and too busy to waste time on false sympathy. It was a bitter March evening when Margaret made her monthly trip to town, the wagon bed loaded with the meager produce she had to trade. She stopped at Chen's restaurant, as she always did, and Sarah took one look at her before shoving a bowl of hot soup across the counter. "You look like death," Sarah said bluntly, her slight accent making the words somehow less harsh. "When did you last eat a proper meal?" "I eat," Margaret protested, but the soup smelled like heaven, and she couldn't remember the last time she'd had meat. Sarah watched her eat with the critical eye of someone who understood hunger. When Margaret finished, Sarah disappeared into the back and returned with a newspaper folded to a specific page. "Read," Sarah commanded. Margaret looked down at the page, confused. It was filled with advertisements, small cramped paragraphs, each one a window into someone's desperation or hope. "Matrimonial news," the header read. Mail-order bride and groom advertisements filled the columns. "Sarah, I'm not—" "Just read," Sarah interrupted. "I'm not saying you should do anything, but you're dying out there, Margaret. Slowly starving, slowly disappearing, and for what? Pride? Fear?" She leaned across the counter, her dark eyes fierce. "My mother was sold to a man she'd never met when she was 15. She had no choice. You have a choice. Maybe don't waste it just to prove a point." Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to explain that it wasn't about proving anything, that it was about protection, about never giving anyone the power to leave her destroyed again. But Sarah had already moved to serve another customer, and Margaret was left holding the newspaper like it might catch fire in her hands. She took it with her, telling herself she'd use it to line her cupboard shelves or start fires. But that night, with the wind howling and the loneliness pressing in like a physical weight, she lit her lamp and began to read. Most of the advertisements blurred together, men seeking women to cook and clean, women seeking men with property and prospects. The language was transactional, practical, empty of anything resembling genuine feeling. She was about to fold the paper away when one entry caught her eye. "Gentleman 34, formerly of Pennsylvania, seeks correspondence with honest woman. Lost home and livelihood to fire in January. Starting over in Wyoming territory with nothing but determination and a strong back. I don't have property to offer or wealth to promise, but I know how to work, how to keep my word, and how to be grateful for a second chance. Seeking a partner, not a servant. Someone who understands that sometimes life burns everything down and all you can do is start again. If your heart has been broken by circumstance and you're brave enough to try again, write to James Hartley, care of Mercy Post Office, Wyoming Territory." Margaret read it 3 times. There was something in the simple honesty of it, the acknowledgement of loss and failure, that resonated in a place she'd thought was permanently sealed. This wasn't a man promising the moon. This was a man who'd lost everything and was brave enough or desperate enough to admit it. She told herself she was being foolish. She folded the newspaper and placed it on her shelf. She went about her evening chores, fed the animals, locked the doors. But as she lay in her narrow bed, listening to the wind rattle her windows, she couldn't stop thinking about that one simple paragraph. What harm could come from a single letter? The thought terrified her, which is how she knew it mattered. For 3 days, she argued with herself. She burned breakfast while mentally composing sentences she'd never write. She mucked out the goat pen while listing all the reasons this was insane. She sat at her kitchen table on the 3rd night with a piece of paper, a pen, and a bottle of ink she'd owned for years but rarely used. The pen felt foreign in her hand, too light, too delicate for fingers accustomed to holding pitchforks and driving nails. She stared at the blank paper until the lamplight made her eyes water. Finally, she began to write. "Mr. Hartley, my name is Margaret Whitmore. I am writing in response to your notice in the matrimonial news, though I confess I'm not entirely sure why. I am 28 years old and have lived my entire life on a farm in Montana Territory that is slowly failing despite my best efforts. I lost my parents within a year of each other, and I have been alone since. I am not looking for rescue, and I have no romantic notions about mail-order marriages or correspondence with strangers. But your words suggested you might understand that life doesn't always offer the choices we'd prefer, only the ones we can manage. If you're truly interested in honest correspondence, then I suppose I am willing to attempt it. Though I warn you, I am far better at mending fences than writing letters. Margaret Whitmore, Creek Bend, Montana Territory." She read it over 5 times, cringing at how cold it sounded, how defensive. But it was honest, and if this James Hartley wanted honesty, then that's what he'd get. Before she could reconsider, she folded the letter, sealed it in an envelope she'd bartered for at the general store, and addressed it in her careful, unpracticed hand. The next morning, she rode steadfast into town through a spring rain that turned the roads to mud. She stood outside the post office for a full 5 minutes, envelope in hand, arguing with herself one final time. You posting that or courting it? The postmaster, elderly Mr. Gaines, had come to the door to watch her deliberation. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. Without another word, she handed him the letter and the coins for postage, then turned and walked away before she could demand it back. For the next 3 weeks, she tried to forget she'd sent it. She threw herself into spring planting, working until her body ached too much for her mind to wander. She told herself he probably wouldn't respond, that the advertisement had likely received dozens of replies from women far more suitable than a hardened, defensive spinster farmer. The response came on a Tuesday. Mr. Gaines handed it to her with a knowing smile she chose to ignore. She shoved it into her coat pocket and didn't open it until she was home, had done all her evening chores and could no longer stand the weight of it against her hip. The handwriting was strong and clear, the letter written on simple paper that showed ink bleed through from how heavily he'd pressed the pen. Miss Whitmore, I cannot tell you how grateful I was to receive your letter. Yours was the only response that didn't feel like a business proposition or charity offer. You said you're better at mending fences than writing letters, but your honesty is worth more than pretty words. You asked in your way why I placed that advertisement. The truth is, I'm not sure I'm brave enough or desperate enough. I think I might be both. The fire took everything I'd spent 15 years building. My workshop, my home, my father's tools that I'd inherited and treated like sacred objects. I was a furniture maker in Pennsylvania, had a good business, a house I'd built with my own hands. I thought I'd found my place in the world. Then one January night, a spark from a neighbor's chimney, wind in the wrong direction, and it was all gone. I stayed for a while after, trying to rebuild, but the truth is, the fire burned more than buildings. It burned my sense of permanence, my belief that anything stays. So I came west because there's something honest about a place where everyone's starting over, where nothing's permanent because it's all too new. I understand you're not looking for rescue. Good. I'm not capable of providing it, but maybe two people who've both learned hard lessons about loss could find something sustainable in honesty. If you're willing to continue this correspondence, I'd like to know more about your farm, your days, what you think about when the work is done. James Hartley. Margaret read the letter 3 times that night and twice more the next morning. She carried it with her as she worked, the paper growing soft from being folded and unfolded. There was something in his words that matched something in her. Not a weakness, but a wound that had healed tough. She wrote back that evening, and this time the words came easier. Over the following months, the letters became a rhythm. Once a week, sometimes twice, the correspondence would arrive. They wrote about practical things. His work helping build a new church in Mercy, her struggle with a coyote that was harassing her chickens. But they also wrote about harder things, carefully, like people learning to walk on ice. He told her about his wife, Mary, who'd died 5 years earlier in childbirth along with their daughter. He'd never mentioned them in his advertisement, but in his 4th letter, the words came spilling out, as if he'd been holding them back and they'd finally broken free. He wrote about how the grief had nearly destroyed him, how he'd buried himself in work until the fire forced him to confront the fact that he'd been hiding, not healing. She told him about Thomas, about the way love had felt like a promise that couldn't be broken until it was. She told him about the loneliness that wasn't just absence, but a presence of its own, something that filled the house like smoke. In his letters, James was thoughtful and careful, but also wry. He could describe a mishap with a saw in a way that made her laugh out loud, a sound so foreign in her quiet house that it startled her. He asked questions that no one else ever had, not about her farm's yield or her financial situation, but about what she missed most about her parents, what she thought about during the long winters, whether she still had dreams that didn't involve mere survival. She found herself thinking about his letters before they arrived, composing responses in her head while she worked. The isolation that had felt like protection began to feel more like imprisonment. The walls she'd built didn't seem as necessary when there was someone who understood why they'd been constructed in the first place. It was mid-June when his letter arrived with a different tone, the handwriting somehow more urgent. Margaret, I've been thinking about something for weeks, and I've written and rewritten this letter a dozen times. I'm just going to say it plainly. These letters have become the best part of my days. I wake up thinking about what I'll write to you. I go to sleep thinking about what you've written to me. I think we've been honest enough with each other to admit that this correspondence has become more than two lonely people exchanging words. I want to meet you, not through words on paper, but in person. I want to see the farm you fought to keep. I want to meet the woman whose strength comes through in every line she writes. I know this is a risk. I know we might meet and realize that what works in letters doesn't work in life. But I also know that I'll regret it forever if I don't try. I'm not asking you to promise anything. I'm not asking you to marry me sight unseen like some storybook romance. I'm asking if I can come to Montana, to Creek Bend, to meet you properly. I'll stay in town, find work to pay my way. No obligations, no expectations, except honesty. If you feel even a fraction of what I've been feeling, please say yes. If you don't, tell me plainly, and I'll respect it completely. But please don't say no just because you're afraid. We've both been afraid long enough. James. Margaret's hands trembled as she read it. Her first instinct was to refuse, to protect herself from the possibility of disappointment, or worse, hope. She paced her small house for hours, the letter clutched in her hand like evidence of her own weakness. But underneath the fear was something else, something that felt like the first warm day after a brutal winter. A tentative, terrifying hope that maybe Sarah had been right. Maybe she'd been dying out here slowly, so gradually she hadn't noticed. Maybe this was a chance not for rescue, but for resurrection. Her own, earned and chosen. That night, she lit her lamp and wrote the shortest letter she'd ever sent him. James, come to Montana. I'm afraid, but come anyway. Margaret. She posted it the next morning before courage could desert her. His response came faster than usual, as if he'd been waiting by the post office. Margaret, I'll be on the train arriving in Creek Bend on July 15th at 2 p.m. I'll be the nervous man with carpenter's hands and no idea what to say. I'll be the one hoping. James. July 15th, 3 weeks away. Margaret felt panic and anticipation warring in her chest. She threw herself into preparations, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was preparing for. She cleaned the house more thoroughly than she had in years. She mended her 2 good dresses, even though both were faded and plain. She practiced conversations in her head while milking the goats, imagining what she'd say when she saw him, how she'd stand, whether she should smile or maintain her usual reserve. Sarah found out somehow the town's gossip network was efficient if nothing else, and arrived at the farm one afternoon with a basket of food and a knowing look. So, Sarah said, setting the basket on Margaret's kitchen table and fixing her with a direct stare, you wrote to one of those men. Margaret felt defensive walls rising automatically. I don't see how that's anyone's business. It's not, Sarah agreed, but I'm asking as your friend, not as the town gossip. Are you ready for this? No, Margaret admitted, sinking into a chair. I'm terrified. What if he takes one look at me and realizes he's made a terrible mistake? What if I take one look at him and feel nothing? What if we've built something in letters that can't exist in real life? Sarah pulled out the other chair and sat across from her. What if it works? Margaret laughed, a brittle sound. That might be even more terrifying. Of course it is, Sarah said matter-of-factly. But you've survived terrifying things before. You survived losing everyone you loved. You survived years alone on this farm. You survived being the subject of every wagging tongue in Creek Bend. You're strong enough for this too. What if I'm not? Margaret's voice came out smaller than she intended. What if I've been alone so long I don't know how to be any other way? Sarah reached across the table and gripped her hand. Then you learn. That's what brave people do, Margaret. They don't stop being afraid. They just keep moving forward anyway. The days crawled by with agonizing slowness. Margaret swung between excitement and dread, sometimes feeling both in the same heartbeat. She read through all his letters again, searching for clues about who he really was, whether her imagination had created someone who didn't exist. The night before his arrival, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed watching the moon cross her window, thinking about all the ways this could go wrong, all the ways her carefully constructed solitude was about to be shattered. She thought about turning coward, about not going to the station at all. He'd wait for a while, then eventually leave, and she could go back to her safe, lonely existence. But underneath the fear, there was something else. A whisper that had been growing louder with each letter. What if you could be happy? What if you could have something more than survival? July 15th dawned clear and hot. Margaret rose before sunrise, did her morning chores with trembling hands, then returned to the house to prepare. She bathed in cold water hauled from the well, scrubbing away the farm smell she usually ignored. She put on her better dress, deep blue cotton, faded at the seams but clean and mended. She braided her dark hair, then took it down and braided it again when her hands wouldn't stop shaking. At noon, she hitched steadfast to the wagon and began the 7-mile journey to Creek Bend. Every rotation of the wheels felt like a countdown. She rehearsed greetings in her mind, discarded them all as inadequate. How did you greet a man you'd poured your soul out to in letters but had never actually met? The town appeared on the horizon, its handful of buildings wavering in the heat. The train station sat at the far end of the main street, a small wooden structure that connected this isolated territory to the wider world. Margaret pulled steadfast to a stop near the station and sat in the wagon, paralyzed. Other people milled about, a family waiting for relatives, a merchant expecting goods, the usual collection of townsfolk who came to see the train arrive because it was the most exciting thing that happened in Creek Bend. She saw Sarah emerge from her restaurant and walk toward the station, then spot Margaret in the wagon. Sarah changed direction, coming to stand beside her. "You're going to sit there and wait?" Sarah asked. "I'm thinking about it," Margaret admitted. "Well, stop thinking. The train's coming." Sarah pointed, and sure enough, a plume of smoke was visible in the distance, growing larger. Margaret's heart began to hammer against her ribs. She climbed down from the wagon on unsteady legs, her mouth dry as dust. The train's whistle split the air, and she nearly turned and ran. Only Sarah's presence beside her, solid and matter-of-fact, kept her rooted to the spot. The train pulled into the station with a screech of brakes and a cloud of steam. Doors opened, and passengers began to emerge. A woman with 2 children, an elderly couple, a salesman with sample cases. Margaret scanned each face, trying to match them with the mental image she'd constructed from months of letters. Then she saw him. He stepped down from the third car, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that were clean but worn from travel. He carried a single canvas bag and looked around the platform with an expression of naked hope and fear that must have mirrored her own. His face was weathered from outdoor work, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more than frowned, and a scar along his jaw that he'd never mentioned in his letters. Their eyes met across the platform, and time seemed to pause. Margaret saw the recognition dawn on his face. He knew her immediately, though she'd never described herself beyond the basics. Perhaps the same thing that let her identify him was at work, the soul's recognition of something it had already touched through words. James began walking toward her, and she found her feet moving to meet him. They stopped a few feet apart, the noise of the station fading into background murmur. "Margaret?" His voice was deeper than she'd imagined, rough with emotion. "James." Her own voice came out barely above a whisper. They stood there, 2 people who'd shared intimacies in ink now struck dumb by physical presence. Margaret noticed his hands first, large and calloused, with old burn scars across the knuckles. Carpenter's hands, he'd said, hands that had built and lost and were ready to build again. She looked up and met his eyes, brown and warm and currently shining with unshed tears. As she watched, one tear escaped, tracing down his weathered cheek. Not a dramatic sob or breakdown, just a single tear that held more honesty than any rehearsed greeting could have managed. In that moment, every wall Margaret had built crumbled, because this wasn't a man trying to impress her or hide his vulnerability. This was a man who'd traveled hundreds of miles to meet a woman he'd only known through letters, brave enough to show his fear and hope and gratitude in one silent tear. Her hand moved before her mind caught up, reaching up to catch that tear with her thumb. James's breath caught at her touch, and she felt the warmth of his skin, real and solid and here. "I guess I'm not much of a first impression," he said, his voice cracking slightly, attempting humor to cover his embarrassment. Margaret felt her own eyes sting with tears she'd held back for years. A smile, genuine and unfamiliar, pulled at her lips. "You're better," she whispered. And in that moment, standing in a dusty train station in the middle of nowhere, with all of Creek Bend watching, Margaret Whitmore let herself hope. The moment stretched between them like something fragile and new, something that might shatter if either of them moved too quickly. Margaret became suddenly aware of Sarah standing a respectful distance away, and beyond her, half the town watching this scene unfold. She dropped her hand from James's face, feeling heat creep up her neck. "I have a wagon," she said, the practical words grounding her back in reality. "Unless you'd prefer to stay in town, there's a boarding house, Mrs. Patterson's place. It's clean." James shifted his canvas bag to his other hand. "I'd like to see your farm, if that's all right, if you're comfortable with it." "It's 7 miles out," Margaret said, then added with an honesty that surprised her. "And it's not much to look at. I should probably warn you now, before you've come all this way for nothing." "Margaret." He said her name like it meant something. "I didn't come for a farm." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Margaret felt her chest tighten, not with fear exactly, but with the overwhelming reality of what was happening. This man was real, standing in front of her, looking at her like she was the answer to something he'd been asking. "Well," she managed, "come on then, before the whole town decides to invite themselves along." She turned and walked toward the wagon, hearing James's footsteps behind her. Sarah caught her eye as they passed, giving her a small nod of approval that Margaret felt absurdly grateful for. As James helped her up onto the wagon seat, his hand warm and steady on her elbow, she heard the murmurs starting behind them. By nightfall, everyone in Creek Bend would know that Margaret Whitmore had met a man from the train, and by tomorrow the speculation would be running wild. Let them talk. For the first time in years, Margaret found she didn't care. James settled onto the seat beside her, placing his bag at his feet. He was close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the afternoon heat, could smell the train smoke and dust on his clothes mixed with something else. Soap and wood shavings, she thought. The scent of a working man who cared about cleanliness. She clicked her tongue at Steadfast, and the old horse began the slow journey home. For the first few minutes, neither of them spoke. The silence felt different from the loneliness Margaret was used to, charged with possibility rather than empty with absence. "He's a good horse," James finally said, nodding toward Steadfast. "He's old and stubborn, but he's loyal," Margaret replied. "My father bought him 15 years ago. I probably should have replaced him by now, but he's family," James finished quietly. She glanced at him, surprised. "Yes, exactly that." They lapsed into silence again as the wagon rolled past the last buildings of Creek Bend and out onto the open prairie. The land stretched endlessly in all directions, golden grass rippling in waves under the wind. Mountains rose in the far distance, purple shadows against the sky. It was beautiful and harsh and lonely all at once, the landscape that had shaped Margaret's entire life. "It's bigger than I imagined," James said, his voice filled with something like awe. "The sky, the space. In Pennsylvania, everything felt contained, hemmed in by hills and trees and other people's land." "Is that why you came west?" Margaret asked. "For the space?" James was quiet for a moment, considering. "Partly. Mostly I came because staying felt like drowning. Everything there reminded me of what I'd lost. Mary, the baby, my workshop, the life I'd planned. The fire was terrible, but in a strange way, it was also permission. Permission to admit that I'd been a ghost in my own life for 5 years. Permission to start over completely." He paused, then added softly, "Permission to hope for something again." Margaret's hands tightened on the reins. "I know about being a ghost. After my parents died, after Thomas, I think I convinced myself that being numb was the same as being safe." "Is that why you answered my advertisement?" James asked. "Because you were tired of being numb?" She thought about lying, about giving him some softer answer, but they'd promised each other honesty in their letters, and she wouldn't start breaking that promise now. "I answered because I was lonely, and because your words made me feel something I thought I'd lost, but also because I was terrified that if I didn't take some kind of risk, I'd wake up at 50 years old and realize I'd spent my whole life hiding." "That's the bravest thing I've ever heard," James said quietly. Margaret let out a short, bitter laugh. "There's nothing brave about desperation." "I disagree." James turned to look at her, and she felt the weight of his gaze. "Desperation makes people do foolish things, reckless things. What you did, reaching out when everything in your experience told you not to trust, not to hope, that took courage." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. They continued in companionable quiet, the wagon wheels creaking, steadfast hooves making a steady rhythm on the packed earth road. The afternoon sun beat down, and Margaret was aware of the sweat dampening her dress, the dust coating her skin. She must look a mess, she thought, nothing like whatever image James had built in his mind from her letters. As if reading her thoughts, James spoke again. "You're more beautiful than I expected." Margaret's head snapped toward him. "You don't need to flatter me." "I'm not." His voice was matter of fact. "In your letters, you described yourself as plain, worn down by work, but that's not what I see. I see strength. I see someone who hasn't let hardship break her. That's beautiful." "You've been here 20 minutes, Margaret said, deflection coming automatically. "You haven't seen anything yet." "I've seen enough to know I was right to come." The certainty in his voice unnerved her. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this connection they'd built through letters could translate into something real, but trust had been burned out of her years ago, and it didn't grow back quickly. "Don't make promises you can't keep," she said quietly. James was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was serious. "You're right. I apologize. I'm getting ahead of myself. We've shared words, but we don't really know each other yet. Not in the ways that matter for building a life together." "So what do we do?" Margaret asked, grateful that he understood, that he wasn't going to push for declarations neither of them was ready to make. "We start simple," James said. "We talk. We spend time together. We figure out if what worked on paper can work in person. No pressure, no expectations beyond honesty. Does that sound reasonable?" "Sounds terrifying," Margaret admitted. "But yes, reasonable." They crested a small rise, and Margaret's farm came into view below them. She saw it through James's eyes. The weathered farmhouse with its sagging porch, the barn that needed new boards, the small fields that were a patchwork of growing wheat, and bare spots where the soil had given up. It was humble and worn and barely holding together. "That's home," she said, unable to keep the defensiveness from her voice. "Like I said, it's not much." James studied the property for a long moment, and Margaret braced herself for disappointment. But when he spoke, his voice was warm. "It's honest. I can work with honest." Something in Margaret's chest loosened slightly. She guided steadfast down the slope and into the yard, pulling up beside the barn. Before she could climb down, James had hopped off and come around to help her. His hands on her waist were gentle but sure as he lifted her down, and for a moment they stood close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "Thank you," she managed, stepping back to put safe distance between them. "Where should I put my things?" James asked, picking up his bag. Margaret hesitated. She'd been so focused on the terror of meeting him that she hadn't actually thought through the logistics. "The barn has a small tack room. It's clean and dry. You could sleep there, for now. Until we figure things out." "The barn is perfect," James said easily, without a trace of offense. She led him into the barn, acutely aware of how little she had, how worn the tack was, how empty the stalls except for Steadfast's and the goats. The tack room was barely bigger than a closet, with just enough space for a cot and a small trunk. "I'll get you some blankets," Margaret said, "and I can bring dinner out when it's ready." "Margaret," James set down his bag and turned to face her. "I'm not a guest you need to wait on. I came here to help, if you'll let me. Whatever needs doing, I can do it." "You just traveled hundreds of miles," she protested. "You should rest." "I've been sitting on a train for 3 days. What I need is to work with my hands." He smiled, and it transformed his face, softening the weathered lines and making him look younger. "Please, let me help." Margaret found herself nodding. "All right. I need to tend the animals, then check the wheat for signs of rust, and the fence on the eastern pasture has been threatening to fall over for 2 weeks." "Show me," James said simply. They worked together through the afternoon, and Margaret was surprised by how naturally they fell into rhythm. James asked questions without making her feel judged. What crops she'd planted, what challenges she faced, what her plans were for the fall harvest. He listened with complete attention, not offering unwanted advice, but clearly thinking through what she told him. When they reached the failing fence, He knelt down to examine it with a professional eye. The posts have rotted through at the base. You need to replace them, not just patch the wire. I know, Margaret said tiredly. I just haven't had the time or the strength to dig new post holes. James stood, brushing dirt from his hands. I can do it tomorrow, if you have spare posts. I can't ask you to. You're not asking, I'm offering. He met her eyes steadily. Margaret, I meant what I said in my letters. I'm not looking for charity or a free ride. I want to be useful. I want to earn my place, whatever that place turns out to be. There was such quiet dignity in his words that Margaret felt something shift inside her. This wasn't a man looking to take over her farm or rescue her from her struggles. This was a man who understood the value of honest work, who wanted to contribute rather than consume. All right, she said softly. Thank you. They continued their tour of the property, James making mental notes of repairs needed, asking about her water source, studying the layout of the fields with the eye of someone who understood land and how to work it. By the time the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, they'd covered every corner of the farm. I should start dinner, Margaret said, suddenly aware that she hadn't fed him anything since he'd arrived. It won't be fancy. Fancy is overrated, James replied. I've been eating train food for 3 days. Anything else will taste like heaven. They walked back to the house together, and Margaret felt the strangeness of having someone beside her, of having to be aware of another person's presence. It had been so long since she'd shared her space with anyone that she'd forgotten what it felt like. The small adjustments, the awareness of where someone else was, and what they might need. The pump is around back, she said, gesturing. If you want to wash up. Thank you. James headed toward the back of the house while Margaret went inside, suddenly seeing her kitchen through a stranger's eyes. The worn table, the mismatched dishes, the empty shelves that spoke of lean times. She felt a flush of shame, then pushed it away. This was her reality. James had said he wanted honesty. Well, this was honest. She had potatoes and onions from her garden, a bit of salt pork she'd been rationing, and flour for biscuits. Simple fare, but hearty. She started a fire in the stove and began preparing the meal, her hands moving through familiar motions while her mind raced with unfamiliar thoughts. There was a man on her property, in her barn, planning to stay, planning to help, planning to… What? Court her? Marry her? Figure out if they could stand to be in the same space together? The magnitude of what she'd done, inviting a virtual stranger into her life, suddenly crashed over her. What if this was a terrible mistake? What if he was hiding something dark beneath that honest exterior? What if… Something smells good. Margaret jumped, nearly dropping the knife she'd been using to slice potatoes. James stood in the doorway, his hair damp from washing, his sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. He looked solid and real, and completely foreign in her domestic space. Sorry, he said quickly. I didn't mean to startle you. It's fine, Margaret said, turning back to her work before he could see the uncertainty in her face. I'm just not used to… company. James moved into the kitchen, keeping a respectful distance. Is there anything I can do to help? You can set the table. Plates are in that cupboard. They moved around each other carefully, like dancers learning new steps. James set out plates and utensils while Margaret finished cooking, the silence between them no longer quite as comfortable as it had been outside. The intimacy of sharing a kitchen, of preparing to share a meal in her home, felt overwhelming. When everything was ready, they sat across from each other at the small table. Margaret served the food, fried potatoes with onions, salt pork, biscuits that were a bit lopsided but edible. It was humble, but it was what she had. James took a bite and closed his eyes. This is delicious. You don't have to… Margaret. He opened his eyes and looked at her seriously. I mean it. After 3 days of stale sandwiches and weak coffee, this is a feast, and even if it wasn't, I can taste the care in it. That matters. She didn't know what to say to that, so she focused on her own plate. They ate in silence for a few minutes before James spoke again. Tell me about your parents. You've mentioned them in letters, but I'd like to know more. What were they like? Margaret set down her fork, surprised by the question. No one had asked her about her parents in years. They'd become just facts in Creek Bend, dead buried, mourned, and then forgotten by everyone except her. My father was quiet, she said slowly. Strong. He could work from dawn to dusk and never complain. My mother was softer. She sang while she cooked. She kept a flower garden even though it was impractical, even though the water should have gone to the crops. She said beauty was as necessary as food. Margaret's voice caught slightly. I let the garden die after she passed. I told myself I didn't have time for impractical things. Do you miss it? James asked gently. The garden? Every day? Margaret admitted, surprised by her own honesty. But it felt wrong to tend something beautiful when everything else was falling apart. James was quiet for a moment, then said, My wife Mary loved to sing. After she died, I couldn't stand to hear music. It hurt too much, reminded me of what I'd lost. I avoided the church when they were practicing hymns. I crossed the street if I heard someone playing a fiddle. I thought I was protecting myself from pain. He paused, his expression distant. But what I was really doing was making my world smaller, cutting out joy because it reminded me I'd once been happy. How did you stop? Margaret asked. The fire, ironically. When everything burned, including all my carefully constructed ways of avoiding feeling anything, I had a choice. I could rebuild the same walls somewhere new, or I could try something different. He met her eyes. I chose different. It's terrifying, but it's better than being numb. Margaret understood exactly what he meant. Sitting here, sharing a meal with this man, letting herself feel the flicker of hope and possibility, it was terrifying. But it was also the most alive she'd felt in years. What happened to your wife? She asked quietly. In childbirth, you said, but can you talk about it? James set down his fork, his expression pained but not closed off. Mary was small, delicate. The pregnancy was difficult from the start. The midwife warned us there could be complications, but Mary was determined. She wanted a family more than anything. He drew a breath. The labor lasted 2 days. At the end, we lost them both, Mary and our daughter. I didn't even get to bury my child with a name. We'd been waiting to name her after she was born safely. I'm so sorry, Margaret said, inadequate words for such a profound loss. I blamed myself for years, James continued. Thought I should have done something different, protected her somehow. But eventually I realized that life doesn't work that way. Sometimes terrible things happen, and no one's to blame. They just happen. Like fires, Margaret said softly. Like fires, like fevers that take mothers, like mining accidents that take fiancés. James reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, but close. We can't control what life takes from us, Margaret, but maybe we can control what we do with what remains. The words settled between them, heavy with meaning. Margaret looked at his hand, so close to hers on the scarred wood of the table. It would be easy to close that distance, to take the comfort he was offering, but comfort had been dangerous before, had led to hope, and then devastation. I'm scared, she whispered, the admission costing her. So am I, James said simply. But I'm here anyway. They finished their meal in thoughtful silence, and afterward, Margaret brought out coffee, real coffee, a luxury she'd been hoarding for special occasions. If a man traveling hundreds of miles to meet you wasn't a special occasion, she didn't know what was. They took their cups out to the porch as the last light faded from the sky. The night was clear, stars beginning to emerge in impossible numbers across the darkening blue. They sat on the porch steps, a careful foot of space between them, and watched the day end. I forgot how many stars you could see, James said quietly. In the city, even a small one, you lose them. They're one of the things I love about this place, Margaret admitted. Some nights, when the loneliness got too heavy, I'd come out here and just look up. It helped somehow, reminded me I was part of something bigger than my own small struggles. Will you tell me their names? James asked. The constellations? I don't know the proper names, Margaret said. My father taught me his own names for them. That cluster there, she pointed, he called the farmhand because it looks like a man bent over a plow, and that line of stars is the journey home. James studied the sky where she pointed. I like your father's names better than the official ones. They're more honest. They sat like that for a long time, Margaret pointing out her father's constellations while James listened and asked questions. The conversation drifted from stars to seasons, from farming to philosophy, touching on everything and nothing. Margaret found herself relaxing, the defensive walls lowering inch by careful inch. "What will you do tomorrow?" she asked as the night deepened and the chill set in. "Start on that fence, if you'll let me, and whatever else you need. I'm good with my hands, carpentry, repairs, general farm work. I learn quickly." He paused, then added, "And I'd like to hear more about your plans for the farm, what you'd do if you had help, if you had resources." "I stopped making plans," Margaret admitted. "It hurt less to just survive day to day than to dream about things that might never happen." "Maybe it's time to start planning again," James suggested gently. Margaret stood, suddenly overwhelmed by the enormity of everything. This man's presence, the emotions stirring in her chest, the dangerous whisper of hope. "I should get you those blankets. You must be exhausted." James rose as well, understanding the dismissal for what it was. Not rejection, but a need for space to process. "Thank you for today, Margaret. For taking the risk of letting me come. For sharing your home and your table. For everything." "Thank you for coming," she said, and meant it despite her fear. She gathered blankets and a pillow from her linen chest, trying not to think about how intimate it felt to provide bedding for a man. When she brought them to the tack room, James had lit a small lantern and was arranging his few possessions on the trunk: a change of clothes, a leather tool roll, a small wooden box that looked handmade. "What's in the box?" she asked, curiosity overcoming propriety. James picked it up, running his fingers over the carved lid. "Letters, all of yours. I brought them with me." Margaret's breath caught. She'd never imagined he'd saved them, let alone treasured them enough to carry them hundreds of miles. "Why?" "Because they mattered," James said simply. "Because they were a lifeline when I needed one. Because—" He met her eyes. "Because they were you, Margaret. The real you. The one behind the walls. I didn't want to lose that." She didn't know what to say, how to respond to such naked honesty. So she simply handed him the blankets and whispered, "Good night, James. Good night, Margaret." She walked back to the house on shaking legs, her mind spinning. Inside, she moved through the familiar routine of banking the fire, checking the locks, preparing for bed. But everything felt different now. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of possibility and terror and the echoing presence of a man sleeping in her barn. In her small bedroom, she undressed and pulled on her nightgown, then sat on the edge of her bed, staring at nothing. She thought about James's tear at the train station, about the way he'd looked at her farm with respect rather than pity, about his scarred hands and honest eyes, and the box of letters he'd carried across the country. She thought about hope, that dangerous, beautiful thing she'd sworn off years ago. And she thought about the flower garden her mother had loved, dead now for 3 years, buried under weeds and neglect. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow she'd show James where it used to be. Tomorrow she'd take one small step toward believing that maybe, just maybe, beautiful things could grow again in soil that had known nothing but loss. Outside her window, the stars wheeled slowly across the infinite sky, unchanging and eternal, bearing witness to one woman's terrified, tentative decision to try, to hope, to live. Margaret woke before dawn as she always did, but this morning felt different. For a moment in that hazy space between sleep and waking, she couldn't place what had changed. Then memory flooded back. James was here, sleeping in her barn, real and solid and waiting. She dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness, braiding her hair with fingers that trembled slightly. Outside her window, the world was still gray and quiet, but she could see a faint glow of lamplight coming from the barn. He was already awake. When she stepped outside, the morning air was cool and sharp, carrying the scent of dew-damp earth. She found James near the water pump, stripped to his undershirt, washing his face and neck. He looked up at her approach, water dripping from his hair, and smiled. "Morning. I hope I didn't wake you." "I'm always up before sunrise," Margaret said, trying not to stare at the way his wet undershirt clung to his chest and shoulders. "Old habit. Good habit for a farmer," James said, reaching for his regular shirt and pulling it on. "I was thinking I'd start on that fence after breakfast, unless you need something else done first." "The fence is fine, but you should eat first." She hesitated, then added, "I was going to make oatmeal. There's enough for two." They fell into an easy routine, James feeding and watering the animals while Margaret prepared breakfast. It felt strange and natural all at once, having someone else moving through her morning tasks, shouldering half the burden she'd carried alone for so long. Over breakfast, they discussed the day's work. James had a methodical mind, breaking down the fence repair into manageable steps, calculating how many posts they'd need, where the weak points were. Margaret found herself relaxing into the conversation, appreciating his practical approach that never veered into condescension. "I could probably get the first section done today if the weather holds," James said, scraping the last of his oatmeal from the bowl. "Tomorrow I'll tackle the second half." "You don't have to push so hard," Margaret said. "You just got here." "I want to," James replied simply. "Besides, the sooner that fence is solid, the sooner you'll have one less thing to worry about." After breakfast, Margaret showed him where she stored the spare fence posts, rough-cut timber her father had prepared years ago that had been waiting for someone strong enough to set them. James hefted one experimentally, testing its weight, then nodded his approval. "Good solid wood. Your father knew what he was doing." "He knew a lot of things," Margaret said quietly. "I just wish I'd learned more from him before." "You learned enough," James said, meeting her eyes. "You've kept this place going alone. That takes knowledge and strength both." They worked separately through the morning, James hauling posts to the failing fence line, while Margaret tended her vegetable garden and checked the wheat for signs of disease or pest damage. But Margaret found herself constantly aware of where he was, her eyes drawn repeatedly to the eastern pasture where she could see his figure moving, digging, working with steady determination. By midday, the sun had climbed high and merciless, beating down with the full force of Montana summer. Margaret prepared a simple lunch of bread and cheese and carried it out to where James was working. She found him stripped down to his undershirt again, sweat soaking through the fabric, dirt streaking his face and arms. He'd already replaced 3 posts and was working on the 4th, his movements efficient despite obvious fatigue. "You need to stop and eat," Margaret said, setting down the basket she'd carried. "And drink. The heat out here can kill you if you're not careful." James straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead with his arm, and smiled. "Yes, ma'am." They sat in the sparse shade of a lone cottonwood tree, and Margaret poured water from the jar she'd brought. James drank deeply, then took the food she offered, eating with the focused hunger of a man who'd been burning energy all morning. "You're making good progress," Margaret observed, looking at the new posts standing straight and solid where rotten ones had been. "It's good work," James said. "Honest work. There's something satisfying about fixing things that are broken, making them strong again." Margaret heard the subtext beneath his words. He wasn't just talking about fences. "Is that what you're trying to do? Fix things?" James considered the question seriously. "Not fix, maybe. Build. When the fire took everything, I realized I'd been trying to preserve something that was already gone. My old life, my old self. Coming west, meeting you, it's not about fixing what was broken. It's about building something new." "That sounds terrifying," Margaret admitted. "It is," James agreed, but it's also alive. For 5 years after Mary died, I was just going through motions, existing, not living. Even before the fire, I was dead inside. At least now I'm scared, uncertain, hopeful. All those uncomfortable things that mean you're actually engaged with life." Margaret pulled a blade of grass, twisting it between her fingers. "I understand that. After my parents died, after Thomas, I thought I was being strong by shutting everything out, but really I was just frozen." "And now?" James asked gently. "Now I'm terrified," Margaret said with a short laugh. "But I'm also, I don't know. Something's shifting." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the heat pressing down around them. Margaret found herself studying James's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the old scar that ran along his jawline that she still hadn't asked about. He was handsome in a rough, weathered way, but what drew her wasn't his appearance. It was the steadiness of him, the quiet strength that didn't need to prove itself. "That scar," she said, surprising herself with the question. "How did you get it?" James's hand moved unconsciously to his jaw. Stupid accident when I was learning carpentry. I was 17, thought I knew everything, wasn't paying attention. A board I was cutting kicked back and the saw caught my face. Could have been much worse. Could have lost an eye or my life. Instead, I just got a permanent reminder to respect my tools and pay attention. Does it bother you, people staring at it? Used to, James admitted, when I was younger and more vain. Now I barely remember it's there. It's just part of who I am, proof that I survived my own stupidity and learned from it. Margaret smiled at that. I have scars too. Not visible ones, but they're there. We all do, James said softly. The question isn't whether we have scars, it's whether we let them define us or just acknowledge them as part of our story. Before Margaret could respond, a rumble of thunder rolled across the prairie, distant but ominous. They both looked up at the sky, where dark clouds were building on the western horizon with alarming speed. Storm coming, Margaret said, standing quickly. We need to get the animals secured. These summer storms can be vicious. James was already on his feet, gathering his tools. Tell me what needs doing. They hurried back to the farmyard, the wind already picking up, sending dust devils spinning across the bare ground. Margaret's experienced eye read the danger in those clouds. This wasn't going to be a gentle rain. This was going to be one of the violent prairie storms that could tear buildings apart and kill livestock. The goats need to be in the barn, she said, her voice raised against the rising wind. The chickens too, and we need to secure anything that could blow away. They split up, moving with urgent efficiency. Margaret herded the protesting goats toward the barn while James chased down chickens and secured them in their coop. The wind grew stronger by the minute, whipping Margaret's skirts around her legs and tearing strands of hair from her braid. By the time they got all the animals secured, the storm was nearly upon them. The sky had turned a sickly greenish gray, and the air felt electrically charged. Margaret knew this kind of storm, had lived through dozens of them, but that didn't make them any less terrifying. We should get inside, she shouted over the wind, but James was staring at something, his face alarmed. Margaret, the wheat! She turned and felt her stomach drop. She'd left the barn door on the wheat storage shed unlatched, and the wind had caught it, slamming it open and shut with violent force. If it broke off its hinges, rain would pour into the shed and ruin what little wheat she'd harvested early. That wheat was meant to be her seed for next year's planting and part of her winter food supply. Without it, she'd be in serious trouble. Stay here, she yelled, but James was already running toward the shed. Margaret ran after him, her skirts hampering her progress. The first fat raindrops began to fall, and then the sky opened up in earnest. Within seconds, they were both soaked, the rain falling so hard it stung exposed skin like thrown gravel. James reached the shed door and grabbed it, fighting against the wind to pull it closed. But the wind was stronger, tearing it from his grip and slamming it back against the shed wall with a crack of splintering wood. He grabbed it again, this time bracing his shoulder against it, and Margaret saw what he intended. He was going to hold it closed until she could secure the latch. She fumbled with the iron bolt, her fingers slick with rain and shaking from adrenaline. The wind howled like a living thing, and the rain was a solid wall of water now, making it nearly impossible to see. Thunder cracked directly overhead, so loud it felt like the world was splitting apart, and lightning illuminated everything in stark, flashing white. Got it! Margaret finally managed to drive the bolt home, securing the door. But as she turned, she saw James stagger backward, his hand pressed to his forehead. In the next lightning flash, she saw blood streaming between his fingers, mixing with the rain. You're hurt! Just a scratch, he tried to say, but she could see he was dazed, probably hit by a piece of flying debris. Margaret grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the house. The storm was at its full fury now, the wind strong enough that she had to lean into it to make progress. Hail began to fall, small stones of ice that bruised wherever they hit. Margaret felt them pelting her back and shoulders as she half-dragged James toward the porch. They stumbled up the steps and through the door, and Margaret slammed it shut behind them, throwing the bolt. The house shook with each gust of wind, and she could hear things outside being torn loose and thrown around. The crash of breaking wood, the metallic screech of bending iron. Sit, she commanded, pushing James toward a kitchen chair. She grabbed a clean cloth in the basin, filling it with water from the pitcher she kept inside. Her hands were still shaking as she approached him. In the dim light filtering through the rain-lashed windows, she could see the cut above his eyebrow clearly now, a gash about 2 inches long, bleeding heavily the way head wounds do. A large splinter from the shed door was embedded in the wound. "This is going to hurt," she warned, then carefully began to extract the splinter. James's jaw clenched, but he didn't make a sound. Margaret cleaned the wound as gently as she could, her heart hammering not just from the storm, but from his proximity, from the warm solidity of him beneath her trembling hands, from the terrible realization of how badly he could have been hurt. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, her voice coming out harsher than she intended. "It's not worth risking your life for wheat." "It's not just wheat," James said quietly. "It's your survival, your future. That was worth the risk." "No, it wasn't," Margaret argued, pressing the cloth against his wound to stop the bleeding. "Nothing is worth—" Her voice broke. "You could have been killed." James reached up and caught her wrist gently. "But I wasn't. I'm fine, Margaret." "You're bleeding all over my kitchen," she said, but tears were mixing with the rainwater still dripping from her hair. "Then I guess we're even," James said softly. "Since I'm standing in your kitchen bleeding because I wanted to protect something that matters to you." Margaret looked down at him, at his wet hair plastered to his head, at the blood-soaked cloth she was holding to his forehead, at his eyes looking up at her with such steady warmth that it hurt. Something inside her cracked, not broke, but cracked open, letting light into places that had been dark for years. "I can't lose someone else," she whispered. "I can't. I won't survive it." "You won't have to," James said, his free hand coming up to rest on her hip, steadying her. "I'm not going anywhere, Margaret. Not unless you send me away." The storm raged outside, shaking the house, but inside, in the quiet space between them, something else was happening. Something that felt like the beginning of trust. The first tentative steps toward believing that maybe people didn't always leave, that maybe some things were strong enough to weather any storm. Margaret became aware that they were both soaking wet, that water was pooling on her kitchen floor, that she was standing between James's knees with her hands on his face and his hand on her hip in a position that would have scandalized every proper person in Creek Bend. She should step back, should put proper distance between them. She didn't move. "I need to stitch this," she said instead, her voice steadier now. "It's too deep to close on its own." "All right," James agreed, though she saw him swallow nervously. Margaret had stitched wounds before, her own, her father's, various animals over the years, but her hands had never shaken like this, never felt so clumsy. She heated her needle in the lamp flame, threaded it with her steadiest thread, and returned to James. "This will hurt more than the splinter," she warned. "I trust you," James said simply. Those 3 words nearly undid her. She took a deep breath and began to stitch, each careful puncture of the needle making her flinch more than it seemed to bother James. He sat perfectly still, his eyes closed, his jaw tight but his breathing even. When she finished and tied off the thread, she cleaned the wound one more time and stepped back. "Done," she managed. James opened his eyes and gave her a slight smile. "See? I told you I was fine." "You have 7 stitches in your forehead," Margaret pointed out. "That's not fine." "I've had worse," James said, standing carefully. "And it was worth it. Your wheat is safe." The storm continued to rage outside, and Margaret realized they were essentially trapped together until it passed. She busied herself lighting more lamps, stoking the fire in the stove, creating warmth and light against the darkness of the storm. James changed into dry clothes in the small washroom, and Margaret changed in her bedroom, both of them moving through the ritual of drying off and finding warmth again. When they reconvened in the kitchen, the atmosphere had shifted. They were hyper-aware of each other, of the intimacy forced by the storm, of the way danger and fear had stripped away another layer of protective distance between them. "Coffee?" Margaret offered. "Please." She made coffee while James sat at the table, and when she brought the cups over, she hesitated only a moment before sitting beside him rather than across from him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "Thank you," James said quietly, "for taking care of me." "Thank you for being foolish enough to risk yourself for my wheat," Margaret replied, but there was no heat in it now, only a reluctant tenderness. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm. The wind had reached a howling pitch and something large crashed against the side of the barn, probably the old chicken coop that had been falling apart anyway. Margaret flinched at each loud noise, and James's hand found hers under the table, warm and steadying. "Tell me something," James said eventually. "Something about you I don't know from letters." Margaret thought about it, sipping her coffee. "I used to dance," she said finally, "before everything. My mother would hum while she cooked, and my father would take her hand and spin her around the kitchen. They taught me the steps, waltzes, reels, all the old dances. We'd dance in the kitchen on winter evenings when the work was done." Her voice grew softer. "I haven't danced since they died. Haven't heard music in this house since then." "Do you miss it?" James asked. "Yes," Margaret admitted, "but it felt wrong somehow, like I didn't deserve to dance when they were gone." But James was quiet for a moment, then stood and held out his hand. "Dance with me." Margaret stared at him. "What, now? There's no music, and there's a storm." "There's always been a storm," James interrupted gently. "Inside, outside, it doesn't matter. But we're here, we're alive, and life's too short to wait for perfect conditions to do the things that matter." His hand remained extended. "Please, Margaret, dance with me." She looked at his hand, scarred and strong and steady, offering her something she'd thought she'd lost forever. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, lamplight flickered across worn furniture and faded curtains. It wasn't romantic or elegant or anything like the dances she remembered from before. But it was real. And he was real. And the offer in his eyes was more than just a dance. It was an invitation to rejoin the living, to reclaim some small piece of joy she'd surrendered to grief. Margaret placed her hand in his and let him pull her to her feet. James drew her close, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers. He began to hum, a simple melody, slightly off-key but sincere, and started to move. Margaret stumbled at first, having forgotten the steps, forgotten what it felt like to move with another person, to be held and guided. But James was patient, leading her gently through the simple box step until her feet remembered what her mind had forgotten. They danced in the small kitchen, lamplight casting their shadows long against the walls, the storm providing percussion for James's hummed melody. It was awkward and imperfect. They stepped on each other's feet, bumped into the table, laughed at their own clumsiness. But it was also beautiful in its simplicity, in the way it transformed an ordinary kitchen during a dangerous storm into something that felt almost magical. Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of grief anymore. They were something else. Release, maybe, or gratitude, or the painful sweetness of feeling something other than numb after years of self-imposed emotional winter. "I'm not very good at this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You're perfect," James replied, and the way he said it made her believe he meant it. The song ended, or rather, James's humming faded away, but they continued to sway slightly, neither ready to let go. Margaret's head had somehow come to rest against James's chest, and she could hear the steady thump of his heart beneath her ear, strong and steady and alive. "Margaret," James said softly, his voice rumbling through his chest, "I need to tell you something." She pulled back enough to look up at him, suddenly afraid of what he might say. "I came here hoping we could build something together," James continued, "hoping what we found in letters could translate to something real. But I need you to know, I'm already halfway in love with you, maybe more than halfway. And I don't want to pressure you or rush you or make you feel obligated in any way, but I also don't want to be dishonest about what I'm feeling." Margaret's breath caught. Part of her wanted to pull away, to protect herself from the vulnerability of being loved, of loving in return. But another part, the part that had been awakened by months of letters and honest conversations, and a man brave enough to stand in a storm for her wheat, that part wanted to step closer, to take the risk, to believe that maybe this time would be different. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know," James said. "So am I. But I'd rather be scared together than safe and alone." The storm outside had begun to ease, the worst of its fury spent. Rain still fell, but the wind had diminished from a howl to a steady blow, and the thunder had moved off toward the east. They stood in the kitchen, still swaying slightly to music only they could hear, balanced on the edge of a decision that would change everything. I don't know how to do this, Margaret admitted. How to trust again. How to hope for something good without waiting for it to be taken away. We figure it out together, James said simply. One day at a time. One honest conversation at a time. One dance in the kitchen at a time. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of him, the steadiness, the quiet certainty that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to figure everything out right now. Maybe it was enough to take one small step, and then another, and trust that the path would reveal itself as they walked it. Okay, she whispered. Okay? James pulled back to look at her, hope lighting his face. Okay, she repeated, stronger now. Let's try. Let's see what we can build together. James's smile was brilliant, transforming his whole face, making him look younger and less burdened. He pulled her close again, this time in an embrace rather than a dance, and Margaret let herself sink into it, let herself be held, let herself hold him in return. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other while the storm outside gentled into steady rain. Eventually they separated and moved to the porch, watching the last of the storm clouds clear away, revealing a sky washed clean and bright. The farm had taken some damage. The old chicken coop was indeed destroyed, scattered in pieces across the yard. Several shingles had torn loose from the barn roof. Tree branches littered the ground. But the house still stood, the barn still stood. The wheat shed was secure, its precious contents safe. They'd weathered the storm together. We should check on the animals, Margaret said, but made no move to leave the porch. In a minute, James replied, his hand finding hers again. Let's just be for a moment. So they sat on the porch steps, hands clasped, watching the sun break through the departing clouds and paint the wet prairie in shades of gold. The air smelled clean and fresh, washed free of dust and heat. Water dripped from the roof edge in a steady rhythm. Somewhere nearby, a bird began to sing, celebrating the storm's end. Margaret thought about her mother's flower garden, buried under years of weeds and neglect. She thought about James's scarred hands and her own scarred heart. She thought about wheat saved and fences mended and dances in small kitchens during storms. I want to show you something, she said suddenly, standing and pulling James to his feet. She led him around the side of the house to a plot of ground that was thick with weeds and wild grass. You couldn't tell anymore that it had once been carefully tended, but Margaret remembered every inch of it. This was my mother's garden, she said quietly. Roses, hollyhocks, daisies, lavender. She said a home needed beauty as much as it needed food. After she died, I let it go. Told myself I didn't have time for something so impractical. James looked at the overgrown plot, then at her. Do you want to bring it back? I think, Margaret took a breath. I think maybe I do. It won't bring her back, but maybe it's a way to honor her, to remember that she was right. Beauty matters. Joy matters. Not everything has to be about survival. Then we'll bring it back, James said with quiet certainty. Together. Margaret turned to face him, this man who'd appeared at a train station just yesterday, who'd spent the day breaking his back to fix her fences, who'd risked injury to protect her wheat, who'd danced with her in a storm-dark kitchen and told her he was falling in love with her. This man who made her want to believe in possibilities again. James, she said softly. Yes? She reached up and touched his face gently, careful of his stitched wound. Thank you for coming, for staying, for being brave enough to hope even when it's terrifying. James turned his head slightly, pressing a kiss to her palm. Thank you for letting me, for taking the risk, for dancing with me. They stood in the ruins of the garden, the evening sun breaking through the clouds in golden rays, and Margaret felt something shift inside her, not healed completely, but healing, opening, growing toward the light like a seed that had spent too long in darkness. Tomorrow, they'd assess the storm damage. Tomorrow, they'd begin the work of cleaning up and repairing. Tomorrow, she'd start making plans again, letting herself dream about futures that held more than mere survival. But tonight, standing in what would someday be a garden again, with a good man beside her and hope flickering tentatively to life in her chest, Margaret allowed herself to believe that maybe broken things could be mended, maybe lost things could be found, maybe scared, scarred people could find their way back to joy, maybe love, once planted in honest soil, could grow. The days that followed the storm fell into a rhythm that felt both foreign and right to Margaret. She'd grown so accustomed to solitude that having James's presence woven through her daily routine should have felt intrusive. But instead, it felt like something essential had been restored, like she'd been walking with a limp for years without realizing it. And now suddenly she could stride properly again. They worked side by side through the cleanup, clearing debris, repairing storm damage, restoring order to what the wind had scattered. James moved with quiet efficiency, never taking over but always supporting, asking before acting, respecting that this was her land, her domain, even as he became increasingly integral to its maintenance. The cut on his forehead healed cleanly, the stitches leaving a thin red line that would eventually fade to another scar among many, evidence of survival, of choosing to act despite risk. Margaret found herself looking at it often, remembering the feel of his skin beneath her trembling hands, the way he'd trusted her completely in that moment of vulnerability. It was a week after the storm when James approached her with something hidden behind his back. They'd just finished the evening chores, and the sun was painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Margaret was washing her hands at the pump when he came to stand beside her, a peculiar expression on his face, nervous and pleased all at once. "I made something," he said. "For you, if you want it." Margaret dried her hands on her apron, curiosity overriding her usual wariness. "What is it?" James brought his hands forward, revealing a piece of wood about a foot long, carefully carved and sanded smooth. Margaret took it from him, running her fingers over the surface, and caught her breath. He'd carved a cross wrapped with vines, and from those vines bloomed a rose, detailed and delicate, each petal distinct, each leaf perfectly formed. It was beautiful, the kind of beauty that came from patient hands and a careful heart. "I found some walnut wood in your barn," James explained, watching her face anxiously. "Old boards your father must have been saving for something special. I hope you don't mind that I used one. I've been working on it in the evenings, in the tack room. I wanted to make you something that meant something." "It's beautiful," Margaret whispered, tracing the carved rose with one finger. "But why a cross and a rose?" James stepped closer, his voice soft. "The cross is for bearing burdens. Yours, mine, everyone's who's ever had to carry grief or loss. The vine wrapped around it is for how life keeps growing even around our heaviest weights. And the rose..." He paused, meeting her eyes. "The rose is for beauty that blooms anyway, even in difficult soil. It's for your mother's garden, for remembering that hope and love can flourish even after terrible storms." Margaret felt tears well up, her throat tight with emotion. No one had given her anything in years, not something made with thought and care, not something that acknowledged her pain while celebrating her strength. The carving was more than just wood shaped into pleasing forms. It was a message, a promise, a declaration carved by hand. "I don't know what to say," she managed. "You don't have to say anything," James said gently, "but I wanted you to have something that reminded you. Love should leave its mark on everything it touches. The good kind of mark. The kind that makes things more beautiful than they were before." Margaret looked up at him, this man who'd appeared in her life such a short time ago, but who already felt woven into the fabric of her daily existence. "You really believe that? That love makes things beautiful?" "I have to believe it," James said simply. "Otherwise, what's the point of any of this? We suffer, we lose, we grieve. If love doesn't redeem it somehow, if it doesn't create beauty from ashes, then we're just surviving until we die. I don't want to just survive anymore, Margaret. I want to live, and I want to love, and I want to believe that matters." She set the carving carefully on the edge of the water trough and reached for his hands, holding them between her own. His palms were rough with calluses, his fingers strong and scarred, but they held hers with such gentle reverence that she felt something crack open deeper inside her chest. "I'm glad you came," she said, the words inadequate but true. "I'm glad I wrote that letter. I'm glad I took the risk." "So am I," James said, his voice rough with emotion. He lifted their joined hands and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "So am I." That night, Margaret placed the carved cross in her kitchen window where it would catch the morning light. She stood looking at it for a long time before bed, running her fingers over the smooth wood, the careful details, the message carved into every curve and line. Love should leave its mark. She thought about marks, the scars on James's hands, the wound on his forehead, the lines grief had carved into both their faces. Maybe James was right. Maybe marks didn't have to be ugly. Maybe they could be beautiful, evidence of survival and strength and the courage to keep trying. The next morning, they began working on her mother's garden. Margaret had been putting it off, afraid of what it would mean, afraid of hoping for something as impractical as flowers. But standing in that overgrown plot with James beside her, she felt ready to reclaim beauty, ready to honor her mother's memory not with perpetual grief, but with blooming things. They spent 3 days clearing the garden. James worked tirelessly, pulling weeds, turning soil, rebuilding the small border fence that had collapsed. Margaret sorted through what remained, finding ancient bulbs that might still have life in them, locating the stone markers her mother had painted with plant names in careful letters. Lavender, Margaret read, holding up a weathered stone. She loved lavender, said the smell of it made everything better. We'll get seeds from town, James promised. We'll fill this garden with every beautiful thing we can grow. On the 3rd day, Sarah appeared in a wagon loaded with supplies. She pulled up to the farmhouse with her usual no-nonsense efficiency and climbed down before Margaret could even make it across the yard. I heard there was a man fixing fences and a woman finally working on that garden again, Sarah said by way of greeting. Figured you might need these. She started unloading seed packets, small plants in pots, bundles wrapped in damp cloth. Margaret stared at the abundance, overwhelmed. Sarah, I can't afford... Who said anything about buying? Sarah interrupted. These are divisions from my own garden, seeds I saved from last year, cuttings from plants that needed trimming anyway. You're not buying them, you're taking them off my hands. James came around from behind the house, dirt-streaked and smiling. You must be Sarah. Margaret's told me about you. Sarah gave him a thorough once-over that would have been rude from anyone else, but was just Sarah being Sarah. You're the one from the letters, the furniture maker who lost everything. That's me, James agreed easily. You planning to stay? Sarah asked bluntly. If Margaret will have me, yes. Sarah looked between them, something softening in her usually stern expression. Good. She needs someone who isn't afraid of hard work or honesty. You seem like you might be both. I try, James said with a slight smile. Sarah turned to Margaret. You look different. Less like you're waiting to die and more like you're planning to live. It's a good look on you. Margaret felt her cheeks heat. Sarah, I'm just saying what I see. Sarah started carrying plants toward the garden plot. Now come help me unload before these poor things wilt in this heat. And show me what you've done with your mother's garden. I helped her plant the original, back when you were just a girl. They spent the afternoon planting together, Margaret, James, and Sarah, transforming the cleared plot back into something that held promise. Sarah knew exactly where everything should go, remembering the garden's original layout with perfect clarity. Under her direction, they planted lavender and roses, hollyhocks and daisies, herbs both practical and pretty. Your mother had a gift, Sarah said as they worked. She could make anything grow. Said it was about talking to the plants, but I think it was really about believing in them, believing they wanted to bloom as much as she wanted them to. I don't have her gift, Margaret said quietly. Maybe not, Sarah agreed. But you have something else. Strength, stubbornness, the will to keep going even when everything seems determined to break you. That's worth more than a green thumb. By evening, the garden was planted. It didn't look like much yet. Small green things in dark soil, more promise than reality. But standing back and looking at it, Margaret felt something swell in her chest. Hope, she realized. The dangerous, beautiful feeling of hope. Sarah left as the sun was setting, refusing Margaret's invitation to stay for dinner with her usual brusque efficiency. Duncan will be wondering where I've gotten to, but I'll be back in a few weeks to see how everything's growing, both the garden and whatever's happening between you two. After she left, Margaret and James stood looking at the new garden in the fading light. Thank you, Margaret said, for understanding why it mattered. Everything that matters to you matters to me, James replied simply. They were standing close enough that Margaret could feel the warmth of him in the cooling evening air. She turned to look at him, at his strong profile against the darkening sky, at the way the last light caught in his hair and made his eyes warm. "James," she said, her heart hammering. "I need to tell you something." He turned to face her fully, giving her his complete attention. "I'm listening." "I'm falling in love with you." The words came out in a rush, terrifying and liberating all at once. "I've been fighting it because I'm scared, because everyone I've ever loved has left or died, because trusting feels like standing on the edge of a cliff. But I'm tired of fighting it. I'm tired of being scared. I'm falling in love with you, and I needed you to know." James's face transformed, joy breaking across his features like sunrise. He reached for her hands, gripping them tightly. "Margaret, I'm not finished," she interrupted, needing to get it all out before courage failed her. "I can't promise I won't be difficult sometimes. I can't promise I won't panic or pull away when things get too real. I've been alone for so long that I don't remember how to be part of something. But I want to try. With you. If you'll be patient with me." "Patient?" James pulled her closer, his hands moving to frame her face with such tenderness that Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. "Margaret, I'd wait forever for you. But I don't think I have to, do I? Because you're here. You're trying. You're letting yourself love me even though it terrifies you. That's not something that requires patience. That's something that deserves celebration." He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. But Margaret didn't want to pull away. She wanted this, wanted him, wanted to believe that maybe this time love wouldn't end in loss. When his lips met hers, gentle and warm and real, she felt the last of her carefully constructed walls crumble into dust. The kiss was sweet and slow, both of them learning the taste and feel of each other, both trembling slightly with the magnitude of what they were acknowledging. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing unsteadily. "I love you," James said, his forehead resting against hers. "I've loved you since your first letter, when you warned me you were better at mending fences than writing. I've loved you through every honest word you've written, every brave thing you've done, every moment you've let me see the real you beneath all that protective armor." "I love you too," Margaret whispered, the words getting easier each time she said them. "I'm still scared, but I love you." "Being scared doesn't mean you're not brave," James said softly. "It means you understand what you're risking, and you're risking it anyway." They stood in the twilight, arms around each other, the new garden at their feet full of promise. Somewhere nearby, a bird sang its evening song. The air smelled of turned earth and possibility. Margaret thought about all the careful letters they'd exchanged, all the words that had built a bridge between two lonely people, and marveled that words written on paper could transform into this: solid arms, warm lips, a steady heartbeat beneath her ear. That night, after dinner, James disappeared into the tack room while Margaret cleaned up. When he emerged an hour later, he was carrying another piece of wood, this one rough and unfinished. "What are you making?" Margaret asked, curious. "Come see," he invited. She followed him outside to where he'd set up a makeshift workshop near the barn, using some of her father's old tools. In the lamplight, she could see he'd been sketching designs on the wood, vines and flowers, leaves and stems, all flowing together in an organic pattern. "I'm making a headboard for your bed," James said, tracing the design with one finger. "Well, eventually. This is just the planning stage. I thought, if I'm going to be here, if we're going to build a life together, I want to make things that are beautiful, not just functional. Your house is practical and solid, but it could use some beauty, like your mother's garden, something that feeds the soul, not just the body." Margaret looked at the sketches, at the care evident in every line. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to," James said. "I want to. Besides, I'm a furniture maker. It's what I do, what I'm good at. I want to fill your house with beautiful things that remind you every day that you deserve beauty, that you're worth the effort it takes to create something lasting and lovely." "Our house," Margaret corrected softly. James looked up sharply, hope flaring in his eyes. "Our house." "If you want it to be," Margaret said, her heart racing. "I mean, we should probably... That is, we should make things proper eventually. Get married, if you want to. I'm not saying we have to rush, but I'm saying yes. To you, to us, to whatever future we can build together." James set down his tools and pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around in a circle that made her laugh, a sound that still surprised her with its unfamiliarity. When he set her down, he was grinning widely. "Yes," he said. "Yes to all of it. To making this our house, to getting married, to building a future together. Yes." They sealed it with a kiss that was less gentle than the first, more urgent, full of promise and passion and the joy of commitment. When they finally pulled apart, both were flushed and breathing hard. "We should probably tell people," Margaret said, trying to catch her breath. "Make it official. I don't want anyone thinking that things aren't proper." "We'll go to town tomorrow," James agreed. "Tell Sarah first. She deserves to know before the rest of Creek Bend starts gossiping. Then we'll talk to the pastor about a wedding." "A simple one," Margaret said quickly. "Nothing fancy, just honest." "Honest is perfect," James said. "Honest is all I want." They worked on the headboard together that evening, Margaret holding the wood while James sketched and explained his vision. He wanted to incorporate elements from the carved cross, the vine, the roses, symbols of growth and beauty emerging from difficulty. He wanted it to be something they could look at for years to come and remember this time, when they chose each other, when they decided to build something beautiful from the ashes of their separate losses. As they worked, they talked about the future in concrete terms for the first time. James had been thinking about starting his carpentry business again, taking commissions from people in Creek Bend and the surrounding farms. Margaret's farm could be supplemented with his income, and his work could be supported by the farm's resources. They could build something sustainable together, a life that balanced beauty and practicality, creation and cultivation. "We'll need to expand the barn," James mused. "I'll need workspace for larger furniture pieces. And we should think about adding a room to the house eventually. A proper workshop attached to the barn wouldn't work for delicate pieces in winter." "One step at a time," Margaret said, but she was smiling. It felt good to plan, to think about a future that held more than mere survival. "First we get married, then we figure out the rest." "Fair enough," James agreed. "But I'm already thinking about what I'll build next after the headboard. A proper table, maybe, big enough for a family, and chairs that don't wobble, and a cradle." He paused, looking at her carefully. "If you want children, if that's something you'd want." Margaret's breath caught. She hadn't let herself think about children in years, not since Thomas died and took that dream with him. But now, looking at James in the lamplight, imagining tiny faces that might have his eyes or her stubbornness, she felt that dangerous hope flare again. "I'd want that," she said quietly. "Someday, when we're ready." "Someday," James echoed, smiling. "I like the sound of someday." They stayed up late working and talking, and when they finally said goodnight, James heading to the tack room, Margaret to her small bedroom, the separation felt wrong somehow. But they'd agreed to do things properly, to wait until after the wedding, and so they maintained the respectful distance even as it became increasingly difficult. The next morning, they rode into town together, Margaret in her better dress, James in his cleaned and pressed shirt. Creek Bend noticed their arrival immediately, of course. The town was too small for anything to go unnoticed. Margaret felt the weight of watching eyes as they tied up steadfast outside Chen's restaurant. But with James beside her, the usual anxiety of being the subject of gossip felt muted. Sarah took one look at them and smiled, a rare and genuine expression that transformed her usually stern face. "Well, it's about time." "We're getting married," Margaret announced, feeling both brave and terrified. "We wanted you to know first." "Of course you are," Sarah said matter-of-factly. Anyone with eyes could see that was coming. "When?" "Soon," James said. "We were going to talk to Pastor Williams today." Sarah nodded approvingly. "Good. Don't give the town too much time to gossip about the timing. Quick engagement is better than a long one when people are looking for scandal where there isn't any." She disappeared into the back and returned with a small wrapped package. "This is for you, wedding present." Margaret unwrapped it to find a beautiful set of embroidered pillowcases, clearly Sarah's work, though she'd never mentioned being skilled with a needle. The embroidery showed intertwined vines with small flowers, remarkably similar to James's carved designs. "Sarah, these are beautiful. When did you make them?" "Started them the day you came in here looking like death, and I gave you that newspaper," Sarah admitted. I had a feeling you'd find your way to someone eventually. Glad it was him. She turned to James. You hurt her, and I'll put things in your food that'll make you regret it for weeks. Understood? Understood, James said solemnly, though his eyes sparkled with humor. But you don't need to worry. I plan to spend the rest of my life making her happy. See that you do, Sarah said, then shooed them toward the door. Go talk to the pastor, then come back for lunch. On the house. Consider it an engagement celebration. Pastor Williams was more than happy to perform the ceremony, though he looked slightly scandalized at how quickly they wanted it done. Are you sure you don't want more time to prepare? Weddings usually require— We're sure, Margaret said firmly. We've already waited long enough. The pastor studied them both, then nodded slowly. I can see you're both of age and sound mind, and Lord knows this town could use some good news. How about Saturday? That gives us 4 days to prepare, post the bands, and make sure everything's proper. Saturday is perfect, James agreed. They spent the rest of the week in a flurry of preparation. Word spread through Creek Bend with typical efficiency, and despite Margaret's preference for simple and private, neighbors began appearing at the farm with offerings. A jar of preserves here, a loaf of bread there, small gestures of goodwill from people who'd watched her struggle alone for years and were glad to see her finding happiness. Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house brought Margaret's mother's wedding dress, which she'd been storing since Margaret's parents died. Your mother asked me to keep it safe, Mrs. Patterson explained, tears in her eyes. She hoped you'd wear it someday. I'm so glad you will. Margaret unfolded the dress with trembling hands. Simple cream cotton with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, yellowed slightly with age but still beautiful. She'd forgotten it existed, forgotten that her mother had hoped for this day. Holding it felt like receiving a blessing from beyond the grave, her mother's approval reaching across the years. James finished the headboard 2 days before the wedding, working late into the night by lamplight. When he finally showed it to Margaret, she couldn't speak for several moments. He transformed his sketches into reality, vines and roses carved with such delicate detail that they seemed almost alive, wrapping around the wooden frame in organic patterns that were both wild and orderly. It was the most beautiful piece of furniture Margaret had ever seen. It's for our bed, James said softly, for the life we're starting. Every time you look at it, I want you to remember that love creates beauty, that difficult things can bloom into something wonderful. Margaret touched the carved wood, her fingers tracing the roses. It's perfect. You're perfect. I'm not, James said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. But I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of you. The night before the wedding, Sarah appeared at the farm again, this time with Duncan in tow. The big Scotsman carried a crate that proved to contain a wedding cake, small but beautifully decorated with cream frosting and fresh flowers. You didn't have to do this, Margaret protested, though she was deeply touched. Of course we didn't have to, Sarah said. We wanted to. You're our friend, Margaret. Let people care about you for once. That night, after Sarah and Duncan left, Margaret stood in her small bedroom looking at her mother's dress hanging on the wardrobe door. Tomorrow, she'd put it on. Tomorrow, she'd marry James. Tomorrow, her life would change forever. She wasn't scared anymore. Or rather, she was scared, but the fear was mixed with so much joy and hope and anticipation that it felt more like excitement than terror. She thought about her parents, about Thomas, about all the loss and grief that had shaped her. She thought about James and his quiet strength, his honest heart, his willingness to stand in storms and carve beauty from simple wood. Tomorrow, she thought, tomorrow we start building something that lasts. In the barn, James was thinking similar thoughts as he lay in the tack room for the last time. Tomorrow night, he'd sleep in the house, in Margaret's bed with the headboard he'd made, with his wife beside him. Wife. The word felt sacred and terrifying and right all at once. He thought about Mary, about the love he'd had and lost, about the fire that had freed him to hope again. He hoped Mary would be happy for him, would understand that loving Margaret didn't diminish what they'd had. It just meant his heart had healed enough to try again. He fell asleep thinking about Margaret's smile, about the way she'd looked in the lamplight as she traced his carved roses, about the life they were about to build together from honesty and hope and the brave decision to love, despite knowing how much loss could hurt. Tomorrow, he thought, Tomorrow, we begin. Saturday morning dawned clear and golden, the kind of perfect Montana day that felt like a gift. Margaret woke early, her heart already racing with a mixture of nerves and anticipation that made sleep impossible. She lay in bed for a few moments, listening to the familiar sounds of the farm waking up, birds singing, the goats bleating softly, the distant sound of James already moving around in the barn tending to the morning chores. Today she was getting married. She rose and dressed in her work clothes, knowing she'd have hours of preparation before the ceremony. Sarah had promised to arrive early to help, and Mrs. Patterson would come to do her hair. But first the animals needed feeding, and the house needed readying. Some things didn't change, even on your wedding day. She found James by the chicken coop, scattering feed while the hens clucked around his feet. He looked up at her approach, his face breaking into that smile that still had the power to make her breath catch. "Morning?" he said. "How'd you sleep?" "Barely," Margaret admitted. "You?" "Same." He finished with the chickens and came to stand beside her, close but not touching, both of them aware that this was their last morning as unmarried people, that something significant was about to shift. "Are you nervous?" "Terrified," Margaret said honestly, "but in a good way, mostly. Are you?" "Completely," James said, reaching for her hand. "But I've never been more certain of anything in my life. You're what I want, Margaret, today and every day after." She squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his certainty. "Then let's do this. Let's get married and scandalize the whole town with how fast we're moving and how little we care what anyone thinks." James laughed, the sound warm and free. "That's my girl." They finished the morning chores together, moving in the synchronized rhythm they'd developed over the past weeks. Margaret marveled at how natural it had become, having someone working beside her, anticipating her needs, supporting without smothering. This was what partnership looked like, she realized. Not rescue or takeover, but genuine collaboration between equals. Sarah arrived mid-morning in her wagon, alone this time. She'd brought flowers from her own garden, late summer blooms in shades of cream and pale yellow and soft pink, along with what looked like half the contents of her kitchen. "Duncan's setting up chairs at the church," Sarah explained as she unloaded. "And before you protest about chairs, hush. People are coming whether you want them to or not. Might as well let them sit down." "People?" Margaret felt a flutter of panic. "I thought it would just be a few—" "This town hasn't had a wedding in 2 years," Sarah interrupted, "and everyone's been watching your story unfold. They're not going to miss the ending. Besides, they're coming because they care, Margaret. Let them." Margaret looked at James helplessly, and he just shrugged, smiling. "She's right. We might as well embrace it." The morning passed in a blur of activity. Sarah took over the kitchen, creating a wedding feast from the supplies she'd brought, supplemented by what Margaret had on hand. Mrs. Patterson arrived with curling papers and pins, clucking over Margaret's hair like a mother hen. Other women from town appeared, some Margaret barely knew, bringing covered dishes and offering help with a warmth that surprised her. "You've been alone too long," Mrs. Patterson said as she worked on Margaret's hair. "This town hasn't forgotten you, dear. We've just been waiting for you to remember you're part of us." By early afternoon, it was time for Margaret to dress. Sarah shooed James out of the house. "It's bad luck to see the bride before the ceremony, and we're not tempting fate today," and helped Margaret into her mother's wedding dress. The fabric was soft with age, the lace delicate as spider silk, and as Sarah fastened the tiny buttons up the back, Margaret felt her mother's presence so strongly it brought tears to her eyes. "She'd be proud of you," Sarah said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "Proud that you survived, that you kept the farm, that you're brave enough to try again." "I wish she could be here," Margaret whispered. "She is," Sarah said firmly. "In this dress, in that garden you replanted, in every strong decision you've made. She's here." Mrs. Patterson finished with Margaret's hair, pinning it up in an elegant style that softened her features while still looking like herself. Sarah produced a simple veil, something borrowed from my own wedding, and settled it carefully over Margaret's dark hair. When they finally let her look in the mirror, Margaret barely recognized herself. She looked happy. Not just presentable or acceptable, but genuinely, radiantly happy. The woman looking back at her had hope in her eyes and color in her cheeks, and a smile that came from somewhere deep and real. This was who she'd been before grief had carved away everything soft. And this was who she was becoming again, someone who could believe in joy. "Perfect," Mrs. Patterson declared, dabbing at her eyes. "Just perfect." They rode to the church in Sarah's wagon, Margaret's heart hammering harder with each turn of the wheels. The small white church sat at the edge of Creek Bend, and as they approached, Margaret could see people gathered outside, far more than she'd expected. It seemed half the town had turned out, all dressed in their Sunday best, waiting to witness Margaret Whitmore finally find happiness. "I can't do this," Margaret said suddenly, panic rising. "There are too many people. They're all staring." "They're staring because you look beautiful," Sarah said calmly. "And because they're happy for you. Now breathe and remember, the only person who matters is James. Everyone else is just decoration." Duncan appeared at the wagon to help Margaret down, his usually gruff face gentle. "The lad's inside," he said in his thick accent, near about jumping out of his skin with nerves, but that's as it should be. "You ready, lass?" Margaret took a deep breath. "I'm ready." Mrs. Patterson and Sarah preceded her into the church, and Margaret stood alone in the doorway for a moment, looking down the aisle. The small church was packed, every pew full, and late afternoon light streamed through the simple windows, painting everything in gold. At the far end, beside Pastor Williams, stood James. He'd borrowed a proper suit from someone, Duncan, probably, given the slightly too broad fit through the shoulders, and he'd shaved and combed his hair until it lay almost neat. But what struck Margaret wasn't his clothes or his grooming, it was his face. The absolute joy and terror and love written across every feature as he watched her standing in the doorway. His eyes were shining, and as she watched, a single tear traced down his cheek, an echo of that first tear at the train station that had broken through her defenses and led him into her carefully guarded heart. Margaret felt her own tears rise, but refused to let them fall and ruin Mrs. Patterson's careful work. Instead, she lifted her chin and began walking down the aisle, alone, as she'd been for so many years, but walking towards someone who'd promised to stand beside her through whatever came next. The congregation stood, but Margaret barely noticed them. Her eyes were locked on James, watching that tear track down his face, watching his expression transform from nervous anticipation to something that looked like reverence as she drew closer. When she finally reached him, he reached out to take her hands, his grip trembling slightly. "You're beautiful," he whispered, his voice rough. "So beautiful I can hardly breathe." "You're crying," she whispered back. "Happy tears," James said, smiling through them. "Grateful tears. Tears because I can't believe I'm this lucky." Pastor Williams cleared his throat gently, and the ceremony began. Margaret heard the words as if from a distance. The traditional promises, the sacred vows, the binding declarations that would tie her life to James's forever. When it came time to speak her part, her voice came out stronger than she'd expected. "I, Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore, take you, James Robert Hartley, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to stand beside you in plenty and in want, in joy and in sorrow, in sickness and in health, as long as we both shall live." James's vows were spoken with quiet intensity, his eyes never leaving hers. "I, James Robert Hartley, take you, Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to honor you, to support you, to love you faithfully through whatever storms may come. I promise to build with you, to create beauty with you, to choose you every day for the rest of my life." There were no rings. Neither of them had thought to arrange for them, but Pastor Williams simply blessed their joined hands instead. "What God has brought together, let no man separate. James, you may kiss your bride." James cupped Margaret's face in his scarred, gentle hands and kissed her softly, reverently, as if she were something precious and fragile. The congregation erupted in applause, and when they finally pulled apart, both were crying openly now, tears of relief and joy, and the overwhelming reality of what they'd just done. They were married, they were husband and wife, they were no longer alone. The reception was held outside the church under the late afternoon sun. Tables had been set up covered with more food than Margaret had seen in years, contributions from nearly every household in Creek Bend. Sarah's cake took pride of place, and as Margaret and James cut it together, his hand over hers on the knife, she felt a swell of gratitude for this community she'd thought had forgotten her. People came up to offer congratulations. Some Margaret knew well, others she barely recognized. Martin Fletcher, the banker's son she'd rejected, came with surprising grace to wish them happiness. William Cross, the widower, brought his children to meet the new Mrs. Hartley. Even people who'd just watched from a distance over the years came forward with genuine warmth. "We're glad you found each other," one elderly woman said, gripping Margaret's hand. "This town's seen too much hardship. It's good to witness something joyful." As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and gold, people began to drift away, heading home with full stomachs and lighter hearts. Sarah and Duncan were among the last to leave, Sarah pulling Margaret into a fierce hug that communicated more than words could. "Be happy," Sarah said simply. "You deserve it." Finally, as twilight deepened into true evening, Margaret and James found themselves alone, standing beside the wagon that would take them home. Home. The word had new meaning now, not just a place Margaret survived, but a place she'd share with someone who chose to be there. The ride back to the farm was quiet, both of them processing the enormousness of the day. James drove with one hand, his other arm around Margaret's shoulders, keeping her close. She leaned into his warmth, feeling the solid reality of him, still hardly believing this was real, that she was married, that she'd taken the terrifying leap of trusting someone again. When they arrived at the farm, the buildings looked different in the moonlight, softer somehow, more welcoming. James pulled up beside the house and helped Margaret down, then swept her up into his arms before she could protest. "Tradition," he said, grinning at her startled expression. "I'm carrying my bride over the threshold." James Hartley, I am not some delicate, but he was already moving, carrying her with surprising ease up the porch steps and through the door into their home. He set her down gently in the kitchen, and they stood in the darkness for a moment, just breathing, just being. "Mrs. Hartley," James said softly, testing out the name. "Mr. Hartley," Margaret replied, a smile in her voice. James lit a lamp, and warm light filled the kitchen, the same kitchen where they'd danced during a storm, where they'd shared countless meals, where they'd learned to move around each other. But tonight it felt transformed, sanctified by the vows they'd spoken. "Are you hungry?" Margaret asked, suddenly unsure what happened next, how you navigated this transition from separate lives to joined ones. "Not for food," James said, moving closer. "But I am nervous." Which is ridiculous, I know. We're married. We've declared our intentions in front of God and half of Creek Bend, but still, I'm nervous. "So am I," Margaret admitted. I've never... She felt her cheeks heat. James took her hands gently. "Neither have I. Not really. Mary and I were both so young and innocent, and that was 10 years ago." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I think we take it slow. I think we're honest with each other. I think we remember that we have the rest of our lives to figure this out, so there's no rush to get everything right tonight." Margaret felt some of the tension ease from her shoulders. "Slow sounds good. Honest sounds better." They prepared for bed with nervous care, Margaret changing in her bedroom, their bedroom now, while James changed in the washroom. When she emerged in her nightgown with her hair down, she found James standing by the bed they'd share, looking at the headboard he'd carved with such care. "It looks right here," he said quietly. "Complete." Margaret moved to stand beside him, studying the carved roses and vines in the lamplight. "It's beautiful. Everything you make is beautiful." "Not as beautiful as you," James said, turning to face her. "Margaret, I know this is all new and strange, but I want you to know there's no pressure, no expectations beyond what you're comfortable with. I'm not in a hurry. I'm just grateful. Grateful to be here. Grateful to be your husband. Grateful that you trusted me enough to take this chance." Margaret reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of the scar on his jaw, then moving up to the still healing mark on his forehead from the storm. "You keep saying you're grateful, but I'm the one who's been given a second chance at happiness. You came into my life when I'd convinced myself I didn't need anyone, and you showed me I was wrong. You showed me that being strong doesn't mean being alone." She kissed him then, soft at first and then deeper, letting herself feel the full force of her love for this man who'd traveled hundreds of miles on the strength of letters and hope. James responded with gentle intensity, his arms coming around her, holding her close but never constraining, always giving her room to retreat if she needed it. But Margaret didn't want to retreat. She wanted this, wanted him, wanted to claim the life they'd promised each other. They moved together toward the bed, nervous and eager and tender, learning each other's rhythms, discovering what brought pleasure and comfort and joy. It was awkward sometimes, unfamiliar bodies finding their way, but it was also beautiful in its honesty, in the way they could laugh at their own uncertainty and trust each other enough to be vulnerable. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed beneath the carved headboard, the lamp burning low, their breathing gradually slowing. Margaret felt James's fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder, and she'd never felt so content, so complete. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," James replied. "Thank you for saying yes, to the letters, to the risk, to me." "Thank you for being brave enough to ask," Margaret said. They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other, and for the first time in years, Margaret slept deeply and dreamlessly, anchored by the warmth of another person, by the steady rise and fall of James's breathing, by the knowledge that she was no longer alone. The days that followed their wedding settled into a new rhythm, one that felt both strange and right. James moved his belongings from the tack room into the house, filling spaces that had been empty for too long. His clothes hung beside hers. His shaving kit appeared by the washroom mirror. His carved wooden cross sat in the kitchen window, catching morning light. He set up his workshop in the barn, using her father's old tools supplemented with a few he ordered from Creek Bend. Word of his skill spread quickly, and soon he had commissions, a table for the Pattersons, chairs for the general store, a cradle for a young couple expecting their first child. The money he brought in wasn't much at first, but it was steady, and combined with what the farm produced, they had enough. More than enough, actually. They had sufficiency and hope and each other. Margaret's garden grew as summer faded into fall. The plants Sarah had brought flourished under Margaret's careful tending, and soon the plot was filled with green growing things that promised flowers next spring. Margaret found herself visiting it every day, pulling weeds, watering, talking to the plants the way her mother had. James would often join her in the evenings, and they'd sit beside the garden discussing their day, making plans, dreaming about the future. "I think we should expand the wheat fields next year," Margaret said one evening as they sat watching the sunset paint the sky. "With both of us working, we could manage another 10 acres. And I was thinking we could add that room onto the house," James added. "A proper parlor where I could display some of my better pieces. We could use it to meet with commission clients without having them traipse through our bedroom." "Our bedroom," Margaret repeated, still finding pleasure in the possessive. "I like the sound of that." James pulled her closer. "So do I. I like the sound of all of it. Our house, our farm, our life, our future." As autumn deepened, they worked together to prepare for winter. James repaired the barn roof and reinforced the walls. Margaret preserved vegetables from the garden and what she could trade for in town. They cut and stacked firewood, enough to see them through the coldest months. Everything they did together, and the work felt lighter for being shared. In October, Margaret realized her monthly cycle hadn't come. She waited another week before mentioning it to James, afraid to hope, afraid to be disappointed. But when she finally told him, his face lit up with such joy that she felt her own hope surge in response. "Are you sure?" he asked, his hand moving instinctively to rest on her still flat belly. "Not certain yet," Margaret admitted. "It's early, but I think maybe." James pulled her into his arms, holding her with exquisite gentleness. "A baby, our baby. Margaret, I can hardly believe it. It might not. It's early. Anything could happen." Margaret felt the familiar fear rising, the fear of hoping for something only to have it taken away. "But it might," James countered. "And until we know otherwise, I'm going to choose to be happy about the possibility. We can be cautiously hopeful together." Cautiously hopeful became their motto as autumn progressed. Margaret felt the subtle changes in her body, the tenderness, the fatigue, the way certain smells suddenly made her queasy. James treated her like she was made of spun glass, taking over the heavier chores, insisting she rest more. Margaret protested at first, but secretly she loved being cared for, loved having someone who noticed when she was tired, who brought her tea without being asked, who rubbed her feet in the evenings while they talked about baby names and nursery arrangements. By November, there was no doubt. Margaret was definitely pregnant, her belly just beginning to round slightly. Sarah came out to the farm with herbs and advice, her usually stern face soft with pleasure. "You'll do fine," Sarah assured her. "You're strong, and you've got James to take care of you. Just take it easy, eat well, and don't do anything foolish." "Define foolish," Margaret said, and Sarah laughed. "Knowing you? Probably half of what you do on a normal day. But seriously, Margaret, let James help. Let people help. You don't have to do everything yourself anymore." It was still a lesson Margaret was learning, the art of accepting help, of being part of a partnership rather than struggling alone. But with James beside her, it was getting easier. He never made her feel weak for needing support. He never took over in a way that diminished her. He just helped. Quietly, competently, lovingly. Winter came early that year, snow falling in mid-November and settling in to stay. But the farm was ready. The animals were secure in the reinforced barn. The house was weather-tight and warm. The cupboards were stocked, and Margaret and James faced their first winter together with confidence born of preparation and partnership. They spent the long winter evenings by the fire, James carving intricate details into furniture pieces, while Margaret sewed baby clothes from fabric Sarah had given her. They talked about everything and nothing, their pasts, their hopes, their fears, their dreams. They made love slowly and carefully, James always conscious of the precious life growing inside her. They read aloud to each other from the few books they owned, creating a ritual that would later become bedtime stories for their children. It was during one of these evenings, with snow falling outside and firelight flickering warmly, that James finished his latest project, a cradle made from walnut wood, carved with the same roses and vines that adorned their headboard. He'd been working on it secretly for weeks, and when he finally showed it to Margaret, she wept at the beauty of it. "For our baby," James said softly, "for the life we created together. Every time I look at this, I'll remember how scared we both were, how brave we had to be to choose each other, how worth it all of it was." Margaret ran her hands over the smooth wood, the intricate carvings, the care evident in every detail. "It's perfect. You're perfect." "We're perfect," James corrected, pulling her close. "Together, we're perfect." Christmas came and went, simple but joyful. They attended church services in town, where Pastor Williams blessed their coming child, and the whole congregation offered prayers and well wishes. They shared a meal with Sarah and Duncan, laughing and talking late into the evening. They returned home through fresh snow, Margaret's hand on her growing belly, James's arm around her shoulders, both of them marveling at how completely their lives had changed in just 7 months. Winter deepened, and Margaret grew rounder. By February, there was no hiding her condition. She was obviously pregnant, obviously happy, obviously loved. James had never been more attentive, more gentle, more devoted. He talked to the baby through Margaret's belly, telling stories and making promises about the life they'd have together. He built a rocking chair for the nursery they'd created in what had been her parents' room, finally clearing it out and transforming it from a shrine to the past into a celebration of the future. March brought the first hints of spring, longer days, warmer breezes, the promise of renewal. Margaret's garden, which had lain dormant under snow all winter, began to show signs of life. Tiny green shoots pushed up through the melting snow, bulbs her mother had planted years ago, surviving underground through years of neglect, finally returning to bloom again. "Look," Margaret said one morning, standing by the garden with her hand supporting her aching back. "The flowers are coming back." James came to stand beside her, wrapping his arms around her from behind, his hands resting on her swollen belly, where their baby kicked and shifted. "Of course they are. This is a place where beautiful things grow now." In early April, as the garden burst into full bloom with roses and daisies and hollyhocks in a riot of color, Margaret's labor began. James rode hard to fetch Sarah, who arrived with the efficiency of someone who'd attended dozens of births. Mrs. Patterson came too, and between the two experienced women, they guided Margaret through the long, difficult hours of bringing new life into the world. James stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, whispering encouragement when she was sure she couldn't go on. And when their daughter finally entered the world with a fierce, healthy cry, James wept openly, just as he had at the train station, at their wedding, at every moment when his heart felt too full to contain. "A girl," Sarah announced, wrapping the baby in soft blankets, perfect and healthy and strong like her mother. Margaret held her daughter for the first time, looking down at the tiny red face, the shock of dark hair, the eyes that would eventually be blue like James's. She felt love surge through her so powerfully it was almost painful, protective, fierce, all-consuming love for this tiny person they'd created. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Welcome to the world." James sat beside them on the bed, his arm around Margaret, his finger caught in their daughter's tiny fist. "She's beautiful. She's perfect. You're perfect." He looked at Margaret with such love that she felt tears slip down her cheeks. "Thank you for this. Thank you for her. Thank you for giving me a family again." They named her Rose Elizabeth Hartley. Rose for the flowers that had brought beauty back into their lives. Elizabeth for Margaret's mother who'd taught her that beauty mattered. She was baptized in May beneath the oak tree in their yard, with Sarah and Duncan standing as godparents, with half of Creek Bend in attendance, with spring flowers blooming in abundance all around them. The years that followed were full of the ordinary magic of family life. Rose grew strong and curious, with her father's steady nature and her mother's stubborn strength. 2 years later, a son arrived, Thomas James Hartley, named for both the man Margaret had lost and the man who'd helped her heal. And 3 years after that, another daughter, Sarah Margaret Hartley, named for the friend who'd set everything in motion with a newspaper and some timely advice. The farm prospered under James and Margaret's joint stewardship. The fields expanded. The barn was enlarged to accommodate James's growing carpentry business. The house gained that parlor James had envisioned, along with additional bedrooms for their growing family. But through all the changes and additions, the core remained the same. The kitchen where they danced in a storm, the bedroom with the carved headboard, the garden that bloomed more abundantly each year. James continued to create beautiful things, furniture that was sought after throughout the territory, pieces that balanced function and artistry in ways that made them heirlooms. Each piece was carved with variations of the same motif, vines and roses, symbols of growth and beauty emerging from difficulty. People who bought his furniture often said it made their houses feel more like homes, as if the love James poured into each creation could be felt by everyone who lived with it. Margaret became known as one of the most successful farmers in the area, respected for her knowledge and her willingness to help neighbors in need. She taught her daughters to garden and her son to respect the land. She never forgot the lessons she'd learned during her years of struggle, the value of self-sufficiency, the importance of planning ahead, the strength that came from surviving hardship. But she balanced those lessons with the joy she'd learned from James, that beauty mattered, that hope was worth the risk, that love was the purpose of it all. On their 10th anniversary, they sat together on the porch as the sun set, watching their children play in the yard. Rose was 12 now, tall and serious, helping her younger siblings with patient care. Thomas was 8, adventurous and kind, always building things with scraps from his father's workshop. Sarah was 5, a wild and joyful child who talked to the flowers in the garden just as her grandmother had. "Can you believe it's been 10 years?" Margaret asked, leaning into James's side. "Some days it feels like yesterday," James said, his arm around her shoulders. "Other days it feels like we've always been together." Margaret looked out at the farm, the expanded fields, the sturdy buildings, the blooming garden. She looked at their children, healthy and happy and loved. She looked at James, his hair now showing threads of silver, his face lined with age but still kind, still strong, still hers. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for that first letter, for coming to Montana, for being brave enough to love me when I was too scared to love you back." "Thank you for answering," James replied, "for taking the risk, for building this life with me." He pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Best decision I ever made, getting on that train." "Best decision I ever made, meeting you at the station," Margaret agreed. They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from gold to pink to purple, as the stars began to emerge one by one. In the garden, roses bloomed in profusion, their scent sweet on the evening air. The carved cross still sat in the kitchen window, catching the last light of day. The cradle James had made for Rose now held their newest addition, another son, born just 6 months earlier, named Daniel for James's father. This was what they'd built together, not just a farm or a house or a business, but a life, a family, a love that had weathered storms and doubt and fear to become something solid and lasting and true. They'd taken the broken pieces of their separate pasts and forged them into something whole, something beautiful, something that would last long after they were gone. The wind that had once carried only loneliness across the prairie now carried children's laughter and the scent of roses and the quiet contentment of two people who'd found each other against all odds and chosen to build something permanent in an impermanent world. Margaret thought about that day at the train station, about James's tear that had broken through her defenses, about the single decision to say yes that had changed everything. She thought about her parents, about Thomas, about all the loss and grief that had shaped her into someone who could appreciate what she had now. She thought about hope, dangerous, beautiful hope, and how it had been worth every moment of fear. "What are you thinking?" James asked, sensing the turn of her thoughts. "That I'm happy," Margaret said simply. "That I'm grateful. That I'd go through it all again, all the loss, all the pain, all the loneliness, if it meant ending up right here, right now, with you." James smiled, that soft smile that still made her heart skip. "Me too. Every single time." As full darkness fell and the children were called inside for bed, Margaret and James remained on the porch a moment longer, hands clasped, watching the stars emerge in their ancient patterns. The same stars that had witnessed Margaret's loneliest nights now watched over her fullest blessings. The same wind that had rattled her windows in isolation now sang through a home filled with love and laughter and life. They'd planted something together, she and James, something that had taken root in honest soil and grown strong despite storms. And like the roses in her mother's garden, like the carved wood that held their story, like the love they'd built from letters and hope and impossible courage, it would continue to grow and bloom and flourish for years to come. Love once planted never stopped growing. It marked everything it touched, making it more beautiful than it had been before. And standing there in the darkness with James beside her and their children safe inside and stars wheeling overhead, Margaret knew that this, all of this, was the truest thing she'd ever known. She was no longer the woman who'd sworn she'd die alone. She was the woman who'd been brave enough to risk everything for the possibility of joy. She was the woman who'd met a stranger at a train station and seen past her fear to the hope he offered. She was the woman who danced in a storm and planted a garden and built a life worth living. She was home. She was happy. She was loved. And that, in the end, was everything, was